Good afternoon, I'm Creeson Agecoutay. Welcome to APTN National News. After more than 9 years of calls for more to be done by the family, an inquest begins today in Regina in the drowning death of a 14-year-old Indigenous high school student. According to a coroner's report in May of 2015, Haven Dubois left his school in East Regina to smoke cannabis with friends. He walked away from their vehicle and was last seen by a creek blocks from the school. He was later found unresponsive in waist-deep water in that creek. The provincial coroner ruled drowning was the cause of death, with cannabis playing a factor. From the beginning, Dubois' mom, Rochelle Bear, has disputed that decision. She believes foul play was involved and a proper investigation was never done. For years, her years of protests and cross-country awareness walks that followed have now paid off with the inquest. It will run this week at the Royal Hotel in Regina. It has been an on and off discussion in Regina for more than a decade, and now 2 city councillors have brought forward a motion to City Council calling for Dewdney Avenue to be renamed as soon as possible. Councillor Andrew Stevens and Councillor Daniel LeBlanc brought forward the joint motion last Wednesday. The councillors say the street named after Edgar Dewdney honors a historical person who was directly responsible for the development and administration of harmful policies towards Indigenous people, including the establishment and oversight of residential schools and Canada's reserve system. Dewdney also withheld food rations, which resulted in starvation in Indigenous communities. Regina Mayor Sandra Masters says the name change could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and 2,500 businesses and residents will be impacted. Councillor Stevens says changing the name is long overdue and it simply can't be left on the back burner any longer.
I think the fact that some folks are so resistant to it because they don't want to have these conversations makes it important. I'd say that this is fairly low-hanging fruit. If we cannot confront a name and changing placards and letterhead, I think it really does question our collective commitment to reconciliation, what it means. Nobody's erasing history. We should talk about Dewdney, but does he deserve a place on that street is another question. I'd say no.
Since 2016, Regina resident Jolie Big Eagle Agecoutay also called for the street to be renamed Buffalo Avenue as an act of reconciliation. City Council will debate the motion in a few weeks' time. Cuts, expenditures, and revenues. That's top of mind in this year's Northwest Territories government budget, which was presented last week in the legislature. Our reporter Charlotte Morit-Jacobs takes a look at cuts and operating surpluses, and most importantly, the implications this will have for Dene, Métis, and Inuit north of 60.
The closure of a jail, job cuts, savings in office leases, and even using the printer less. These are some of the cost-cutting measures the Northwest Territories government says they'll implement. On May 24th, Finance Minister Carolyn Wozniak tabled the 2024-2025 operating budget. The operating surplus sits at $294 million, with $2.6 billion in revenue and $2.22 billion in spending. This year will see $48.4 million in cuts across departments. As with the last few budgets, the NWT is creeping closer to the debt ceiling. Total debt is expected to reach $1.6 billion. That's just shy of $1.8 billion cap they can receive from the feds. So where will all the savings come from? One way of saving $2.7 million is with the closure of the men's jail in Fort Smith, which had more staff than inmates. The building may be repurposed into a wellness center.
But they're all very well trained. We don't want to lose people. And it's an opportunity when you have multiple Indigenous governments from every region asking for the opportunity to have a greater lead, to look together and say we have this wonderful piece of infrastructure. We have staff. It's being underutilized right now, and public dollars are being put towards it in a way that's not effective or efficient, and yet there's a huge need.
The budget proposes cutting 91 public sector positions, reassigning positions that are currently filled. Other cost-saving measures proposed: $1.6 million in saving from infrastructure leases, $900,000 from discontinuing a midwifery expansion program, and $300,000 in printing costs. The minister also commends input from 900 public servants who submitted more than 1,800 suggestions on how to increase efficiency and revenue.
Or that employees emphasized was highlighted, was literally highlighted in blue to all of us so that we knew that feedback and where it had come from. So it really was quite front and center. And some of what was suggested, again, not being ribbon cutting, like one of my sort of favorite things is fleet management, is actually having consolidated fleet management, and that was highlighted from staff. What does it mean I'll get to your question now, but what does it mean in terms of, the system?
With the closure of Diavik Diamond Mine in 2026 and the NWT's reliance on public service jobs, the minister says diversification is key.
I don't even want to venture a guess as to how many budgets and how many years and how many assembly cycles there's been efforts to sort of quote unquote force a diversification of the economy from government to the private sector. The private sector is the best placed entity to diversify the private sector, not. The government can't create an economy or create a sector. We can be there to fill gaps.
Wozenik says more money into housing will help attract and maintain workers. The budget cites diversification with new money for resource extraction projects, commercial fishing, tourism, and film. MLAs will discuss the proposed budget and vote before the end of spring session on June 13th. Charlotte Mort-Jacobs, APTN National News, Yellowknife.
An Indigenous legislature is set to make history in Ontario this week. Saul Mamakwa will rise in the chamber on Tuesday to ask a question in OG Cree. His family, friends, and elders will be watching from the gallery. This is the first time the Ontario legislature will allow a language other than English or French to be used. Mamakwa is the only First Nation legislature at Queen's Park in Ontario. The moment comes decades after he was punished in a residential school for speaking his own language. To Winnipeg, where the federal government unveiled $31 million in funding to the Southern Chiefs organization to help revitalize downtown Winnipeg. The funding will help the SCO develop the Weiwei Na Bega Kinagan project in the former Hudson's Bay Company building. Sierra Bettens has more.
All people deserve a place to call home. Right here in this very building, we will witness the creation of 350 much-needed units for housing of First Nations families, post-secondary students, elders, and our veterans.
In a few years, this former Hudson's Bay Company building is slated to reopen with affordable housing units, a childcare center, and even a museum. Today, the federal government dedicated $31 million in funding to the Southern Chiefs organization to support the Weiwei Na Bega Kinagan redevelopment project.
We know that cities are judged by downtowns, and we know that downtown housing is absolutely critical to a safer, more vibrant Winnipeg. We also know that Winnipeg is Canada's most vital city when we talk about reconciliation.
$25 million of funding comes from Infrastructure Canada to support building repairs and upgrades. The remaining $6 million from Prairie's Can will support the creation of Mi'kmaq Connect, a First Nations workforce recruitment app. The team hopes to hire over 400 people to work on the redevelopment project through the app. Manitoba Minister of Housing, Addiction and Homelessness, Bernadette Smith, said the province will dedicate up to $10 million in funding for the project, in addition to their $25 million Bay Building Fund.
This continuum of care that we've been talking about, getting people from encampments into homes, into employments, and into even imagining owning their own home. This is what I see this place being.
SCO Grand Chief Jerry Daniels said the project is developing more housing that will total 358 units. That's up from the estimated 200 units previously planned. The project will also develop services like childcare and subsidized food costs.
There's more units here than had initially been here 2 years ago, and so we added an entire floor of units here, so there's going to be more housing here than there was initially.
While the timeline isn't set in stone, Grand Chief Daniels said they hope to host a soft opening on the building's 100th birthday in 2026. Sierra Bettens, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
When we return, Saugeen First Nation and their decision on having nuclear waste in their territory. Stick around, we'll be right back. Welcome back. A new Senate report is calling on the federal government to launch an aggressive campaign to revitalize Canada's dormant seal industry. APTN's Fraser Needham has that story.
At a press conference in Ottawa this week, Senator Fabian Manning acknowledges it will be an uphill battle, but says it is Canada's responsibility to reestablish export markets for sealed products.
There's opportunity there, but it has to be driven by the Canadian government. These are international discussions. We talk about international trade, even with our partners in the United States, and the opportunities, with the 350 million people on our doorstep.
Manning is part of the Senate Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. It released a new report on the sealing industry, how decades of anti-sealing campaigns led to export bans of sealed products around the world, decimating the industry. The study makes 9 recommendations to revive the sealing industry, including implementing sustainable seal management strategy within 6 months, establishing a seal study center of excellence, and working with Indigenous governments and industry to formulate a national education campaign that accurately portrays seal harvesting. Senator Brian Francis is of Mi'kmaq heritage and also sits on the Senate's Fisheries Committee. He says Inuit and First Nations people have practiced sustainable seal harvesting for generations.
Inuit and First Nations have harvested seals for subsistence purposes for thousands of years. The traditional harvest has been central to our cultures and way of life for generations, far longer than the commercial harvest. The relationship between our communities have with sealing is deep, meaningful, and respectful, and something that should be preserved.
Manning says dispelling misinformation by anti-sealing lobby groups is one of the major challenges.
There's a widespread misconception that baby seals are harvested in Canada. It hasn't happened since 1987. It's illegal in Canada to harvest harp and hooded seal pups. But when you go out and you see the anti-sealing propaganda, they show harvesting of seal pups. It's a lie. It's a falsehood.
Francis agrees it is time to set the record straight on the industry.
Important that that be reversed now, and that we start looking not to villainize those that are harvesting proper methods in terms of seals, and it's just another process.
The report also calls on the government to withdraw charity status and tax advantages to groups who promote inaccuracies against the sealing industry. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Leaders at a local First Nation say they won't rush a decision on a potential nuclear waste storage facility proposed for their territory. The company behind the project has indicated that a decision would come this year, but as Scott Miller reports, no vote has been scheduled on the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation.
The chiefs in charge of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation say their communities will get to vote on whether they want Canada's most radioactive waste to be buried in their territory or not.
The Saugeen Ojibwe Nation will have a referendum, and the majority wins.
When that vote will take place is still up in the air. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization, tasked with finding a permanent home for Canada's used nuclear fuel, wants to select a site by year's end.
That's NWMO's goal. Whether we'll be able to meet that target is, I would say, no, not realistic.
The Nuclear Waste Management Organization has designs to potentially bury Canada's high-level nuclear waste here, under 1,500 acres of farmers' fields north of Teeswater. Now, those farmers' fields fall within the territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. The NWMO says the project will not move forward without the approval of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation or that of the local municipality, the municipality of South Bruce, who scheduled a community referendum on the project this October.
Worldwide, it's accepted as the right thing to do, is to put it well beneath where it can be contained and safely stored.
In January of 2022, members of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation voted overwhelmingly against plans to bury Ontario's low and intermediate level nuclear waste within 2 kilometers of Lake Huron. Nadjawan says while this project is different, the biggest question facing Sown voters will be, is containing the radioactive waste in underground containers the safest thing to do now and forever?
And you got to ask yourself the question, if they do break down, what is the risk of that uncontained radioactive waste making its way to the surface where it could have an impact?
Najawan says SOAN will continue to educate itself and its members on the NWMO's nuclear waste plan and will hold their community referendum when they feel the time is right, whether that's this year or next. In Wyerton, Scott Miller, CTV News.
Now to this week's web poll question. Are you noticing the impacts of climate change where you live? You have 4 choices and they are not at all, a little bit, somewhat, a lot. Have your say at aptnnews.ca. A new book from a Métis Ukrainian in the United States is presenting a new twist on self-determination. We'll be back in less than 3 minutes. Newfoundland and Labrador, St. John's 5, PEI, Charlottetown 12. Northern Quebec, Nuujiwak 6, La Grande River 13. Southern Quebec, Quebec City 12, Montreal 19 with clouds and rain. Southern Ontario, Toronto, rain as well, 17 with sun in London. Northern Ontario, Timmins 24, Wawa 15 with cloud. Northern Manitoba, Churchill 0, Norway House 8. Southern Manitoba, Gimli 10, Brandon 14 with a little bit of cloud. Southern Saskatchewan, Regina at 14, Estevan 11. Northern Saskatchewan, Stony Rapids 8, Meadow Lake 13. Northern Alberta, Fort McMurray 15 with sun, Peace River 9. Southern Alberta, Edmonton 7, Lethbridge 25 with rain. Southern BC, Vancouver 11, Quesnel 7. Dease Lake 5, Smithers 6. In the Yukon, Rock River 0, Whitehorse 7. Northwest Territories, Yellowknife 11, Fort Simpson 9. In Nunavik 0, Colville Lake 8. Baker Lake 1, Chesterfield 1 as well. And in Nunavut, Igloolik -4, Arctic Bay 0. A new novel from the University of Minnesota Press features themes of self-determination and reclamation with a twist. Author Connor Kerr is excited this is his second novel. Indian Country Today's Shirley Sneeve has this interview.
It's a girl meets boy story that gets complicated. Gray, a young woman activist, meets up with Ezzy, who's trying to clean up his act after prison. They steal a herd of bison and set them free in a city park.
There was I remember a news story maybe a decade ago now out of Camrose, Alberta, where a bison herd had got loose from a neighboring farm and was stampeding through the city of Camrose. And I thought, what a funny thing, to see, for the people who are up at 4:30 or 5 a.m., beautiful summer morning, you're driving to work with your coffee, and here comes 50 bison cruising down Main Street right at you, and what that looks like, And so I kind of took that idea and thought about it for what would it really look like if there's all these bison that are in, a public park in the middle of Edmonton? What would it look like for the people who, have been using this park, and all of a sudden there's a herd of bison there? And as we know, the bison are such a natural part of the landscape. They survive and thrive everywhere. So them coming back just seemed to be such a funny way of kind of introducing this idea of a new form of kind of, I guess, activism to claim land back.
Yeah, so instead of land back, it's bison back. So
yeah.
I think that's brilliant. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about is the two main characters in the story, a young lady and a troubled young man.
I would say that Gray, the young lady, the Métis lady, who's kind of the lead activist there and runs these organizations and these protest movements, is really a composite character of a lot of people that I know who do incredible work behind the scenes to really give pride to Indigenous voice, to really lead activist movements, to lead movements towards Indigenous-owned solutions for climate change, for a better future for youth when it comes to education, for cultural knowledge. And there's all these incredible people that I know who are doing such good work behind the scenes, and they don't want any praise, they don't want any publicity, they don't want anything like that, and they're constantly just working to create a better future for Indigenous people. And then I guess there's a third kind of character in here, this Tyler guy who kind of comes in and starts taking credit for a lot of these movements that are happening and tries to almost build a brand based around the activism that's going on. And I really wanted to kind of play onto what that looks like for people who are trying to almost get rich or build a brand based around, being their idea of activism.
The young male character who's getting out of prison.
So Ezzy, yeah, he's kind of modeled on this idea of a lot of young Indigenous men who just don't really have that sense of purpose or direction in this current Western capitalist society that we're living in, where they've been ostracized by growing up through these foster care systems and group homes, and which are really just a pathway directly into often the carceral system, jail, and they're never really given a hope or an opportunity. And so if you're looking at Ezzy as a character, he's often just waiting. He's just waiting constantly for something to happen. And he doesn't know how to really take initiative, and he doesn't really want to take initiative either. And so when he gets an opportunity to really fall into something that he believes in, where he can learn more about his community, his culture, his history, what it means to be Indigenous to those lands and those areas, he falls right in line with it and really wants to help Gray because he wants to believe in something, to belong to something. And it's what kind of fits for it, and what allows him to eventually, make his own versions of sacrifices, whether Gray wants him to or not, towards this larger kind of movement.
I really have to comment about your commentary on the foster care system. I know you're in Canada and we're down here in the United States, but it's a mirror story.
Oh, absolutely. I was fortunate to be in Navajo territory not that long ago and chatting with some people down there around, just a similar type experiences with these government systems that are put in place on Indigenous peoples, and what it actually looks like for us to take back control over our own forms of governance, whether that comes to education, whether it comes to raising our own children, whether it comes to like making sure that we're, that really at the end of the day, that the kids know themselves and know what it means to be Indigenous. And I honestly think within writing a lot of the books and the books that I've written, as well as this Prairie Edge here, I would love for young, Indigenous people to be able to see themselves reflected in these books within the characters, and to see that's all right to learn about culture, to learn about history, and that they're not alone in what they're often feeling when they're, coming up against these systems on a regular basis.
Prairie Edge by Connor Kerr. Shirley Snavy, ICT News.
And that is your midday newscast for this Monday, May 27th. We'll be back again with more news stories in our next APTN National newscast in a few hours. From everyone at APTN National News, hi miigwech, masicho. Thank you for watching.